8:30 Tuesday on ABC, Annika. A fresh-faced Swedish girl on holiday in Britain meets Pete, a freewheeling girl chaser who takes life and romance as it comes.
Can I take you out tomorrow night?
Yes.
But this girl is different. Annika is special, and she's about to change his life.
You go back to Sweden tomorrow. A few weeks. You'll have forgotten me.
I won't.
I love you.
An intensely moving story of young love. Annika premieres 8:30 Tuesday on ABC. 8 o'clock Wednesday. Nurse training has moved from the hospital wards to the classrooms of academia. But will the tertiary system be able to prepare the nurse for the rigours of frontline healthcare?
When patients are told that they have cancer, that to them is usually a death sentence. And when the doctor has gone, you usually have to go back and pick up the pieces.
I'd rather be knocked down by a motor car outside.
The Nightingale Legacy. Open file, 8 o'clock Wednesday on ABC. Coming up, Entertainment Plus, as Clive James talks to the volatile Germaine Greer and Alan Coren, editor of Punch magazine.
Hello again, John Amies with the latest updates from the National. The much-awaited tax summit got underway in Canberra today with the Queensland Premier, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, receiving an ecstatic welcome from thousands of farmers when he arrived at Parliament House. The farmers, who were holding a protest rally outside Parliament House, had earlier jeered the Prime Minister, Mr Hawke, but when Sir Joh arrived, the protesters cheered loudly. Sir Joh responded by telling the farmers he'd come prepared for a fight. Former New South Wales Corrective Services Minister Rex Jackson has been committed for trial on conspiracy charges related to the early release of prisoners. The magistrate, Mr Brown, committed Jackson and 3 others to trial in the District Criminal Court. All have denied that they conspired to pay Jackson money to induce him to act corruptly. And closer to home, insurance assessors from Adelaide will go to Port Lincoln in the morning to examine the Greek cargo ship which was damaged by a fire late yesterday. The vessel, the Sea Tiger, is being towed to Port Lincoln following a fire in its engine room. The ship's crew extinguished the fire, believed to have started in a generator. A spokesman for the Sea Tiger's Adelaide agent said that its owners were flying to South Australia from Athens to inspect the damage. The price of water for South Australians went up today, but ratepayers won't know by how much until later this week. The price of 1 kilolitre of water, now 53 cents, has risen by 38 cents over the past 2 years. And in football news, 2 of South Australia's most promising young footballers, Peter Motley and Craig Bradley, have signed what is believed to be a record deal to play for the VFL club Carlton. The contracts are said to be worth $300,000. Not bad. Finally, a look at tomorrow's weather. For South Australia, we can expect a fine and mild to warm day at first, with strengthening north to northwesterly winds. A cooler southwesterly change developing in the far west should gradually extend eastwards with a few scattered showers in the south. There's a strong wind warning for all coastal waters. For the city of Adelaide, we can expect a fine day at first, but a shower or two developing later ahead of the change. The temperatures, a low overnight of 9 and a top tomorrow of 20. And that's all we have for now, but I shall be back a little bit later with another news break from the National. See you then.
10 o'clock Tuesday night, ABC is proud to present the premiere of the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of Nicholas Nickleby, the universally acclaimed adaptation of Charles Dickens's classic novel of a young man's quest to seek his fortune against all odds. His heartless and miserly Uncle Ralph, the cruel and brutal Mr. Squeers, and Smike, the boy he befriends. Presented in 6 parts over 2 weeks, Nicholas Nickleby premieres 10 o'clock Tuesday on ABC.
What you're about to see is another episode from the second series of our late-night talk show, which first appeared on Britain's Channel 4. Alan Coren, editor of the magazine Punch, can also ride horses, fly planes, and, judging by the luxuriance of his tweeds, make money. But in this show, he faced the most daunting task of his career, matching wits with Germaine Greer, Australia's #1 intellectual after John Newcombe. I hardly ever meet Germaine except in talk show studios in Britain and Australia, so what she has to say is always a surprise. That's why I look a bit afraid sometimes. But first, I get the floor all to myself, straightening out the small but loyal audience on the true significance of world events. Late again. I'm still trying to find my way around our big budget new set with the star entrance two-step staircase. Before we get to the rest of the show, here's the latest news. Nobody gets the news later than us because no one else is working on a lower budget. But what we lack in speed, we make up for with insight. The mission to explain. As part of Britain's continuing effort to make Arab friends in the Middle East, the Emir of Bahrain, the tallest man in the Persian Gulf, was flown to London and allowed to touch Prince Charles. And Norman Tebbit adopted the turban. Big sex story of the week was all about Leonid Brezhnev. The gaff was blown by Richard M. Nixon, who revealed that Brezhnev was one for the ladies, even during his last 10 years in office, when he was unofficially considered dead. The Daily Express carried a photo of Brezhnev clamping the mince pies on actress Jules St. John. But our late research is able to reveal that Brezhnev's real passion wasn't for females, but for Nixon himself. Second biggest sex story concerned Prince Andrew and Deborah Yon, the waitress he danced with on St. Helena. The star not only got the picture, it got the conversation, including Andrew's opening spiel, which was obviously based on the principle that it doesn't matter what you tell them, as long as you tell them something. "That's an odd Coca-Cola can," he said. "I've never seen one that small before." The Sun wasn't close enough to hear Andrew chat Deborah up about the micro Coke can, but with the advantage of standing back a bit, they were able to notice that she was dusky. The Mail also spotted that Deborah was dusky, but said so in larger type. The Express noticed the same thing in type bolder still. The Sun was still calling Deborah dusky 2 days later in a story which allayed readers' fears by pointing out that the only reason he chose the dark girl was because all the others were too young. The Deborah story kept all those Fleet Street reporters busy who weren't already chasing Torval and Dean on Barbados. With the whole of Fleet Street transferred to tropical islands in the Atlantic, London has been a quieter and, dare one say it, a cleaner place. On the continent, of course, they chased the British royals with a greater willingness to let inspiration play its part. The German magazine Wochenend, meaning weekend, found out by means unstated that Charles has gone off Diana. Literally translated, the headline says, "Diana's secret worry. Finds Charles her no more desirable?" They say it's because she's no longer so well-nourished. A persuasive argument to the Germans, who eat a great deal and don't really trust anyone who doesn't. Wochenend's competitor, Neue Post, New Post, is so keen on Charles, Diana and William that it runs 2-page reports on their lookalikes, in which it is revealed that looking like Charles, Diana and William is no picnic, perhaps because German camera crews are continually arriving at the front door in half-track vehicles. Neue Post is needle-sharp in its reporting of Diana's impact on the English national consciousness. They say, and I quote, "The princess has, in her popularity, even overflown Margaret Thatcher." Even that. But the Euro country which remains craziest about the British royals is Spain, perhaps because royalty is the only thing that holds their constitution together. Down there, they're even madder about Diana than we are, and this week the magazine Hola, it means Hola, ran the best ever picture of what happened on that memorable evening when only half of her dress came back from Sketchley's. In the same issue, however, the Spaniards were very worried about how she bites her fingernails. "In the circle around her hand," says the caption, "can be appreciated with clarity her nails extremely short." And there's another picture to help blow the whistle on what they call her little secret, which they say causes her, if it is pointed out, to blush and with an expression of a child surprised in naughtiness, hide her little hands under her shoulders. Following last week's story about the storm of bee excrement in Southeast Asia, we had the only picture of it. The buzz this week is that 3,300 bees went up in the space shuttle. Bees get afraid up there, and after a couple of orbits, this is what it looked like in the shuttle's cargo bay. Serious news now. The Masons are taking over the world. It's all in this book about Masons by Stephen Knight. The Masons communicate with secret handshakes and other subtle signs known only to themselves. Here, President Reagan secretly recognizes a fellow Mason. He's the cultural attaché of the Central American Republic of Piranha. Both are Grand Moose of the Imperial Order of Hair Dyers. The Prime Minister of the Netherlands, otherwise a supreme Dutch cheese of the Council of Bunch Tulips, receives a reassuring secret palm tickle from a prominent Masonette. This almost invisible sign identifies a great owl to any other great owl who might be watching. Here is a great owl unobtrusively saying, "Let's meet later," at the moment we are being spied on by the media. A Lord High bald ginger eagle surreptitiously indicates to other members of his lodge that he has run out of head and shoulders. A clandestine exchange of greetings between a Lord High bald ginger eagle and a great owl. But enough of that. The Masonic lodges are too powerful to be lightly flouted. Back to safer ground with the Sun's daring expose of predatory females, the girls who treat men as sexual objects and who employ lines of approach which would leave even Prince Andrew flat-footed. Jane Speller, whose hunting ground is Queen's Disco in West Drayton, knows how to make that shy-seeming move which indicates to a sensitive man that the evening has possibilities. I pick my target, then go up and spill my drink over him. And Deborah Smith, who haunts Romeo and Juliet's in Bristol, describes how she and her friend Deborah get through to the sophisticated men of the world. Our technique is to walk past a bloke we fancy and pinch his bum. So if you're standing in a disco and your frilled shirt front gets soaked with a vodka slimline, at the exact moment when you feel a piercing pain in the behind, you'll know it's your lucky night. But if the Sun keeps taking Fleet Street to new levels, its rival, the Mirror, still hangs on to those solid old working-class inhibitions, or did until recently. Ever since the Sun flagrantly bared the Page 3 girls' breasts, the Mirror has held out against doing the same. The Mirror girls' nipples have always been concealed by some means, however tenuous. Until recently, this was almost as far as a Mirror girl ever went. But last Friday, the strain of a sinking circulation finally tipped the Mirror over the edge. The shock in the boardroom must have been too much, however, because next day, the delicate items of anatomy were gone again. Meanwhile, the Express roared ahead with a mouth-watering picture of dusky tropical beauty Jean Rook, showing the kind of hold she has on her editor. The Page 3 pin-up was always based on the premise that whereas a naked woman might delight a man, the same was not true in reverse. But now a micro-bopper magazine called Oh Boy has taken to running Page 3 pin-ups of likely lads with their massive chests bared to the keen English wind. In last month's issue, they featured the hulking torso of Tony Wright-Jones. Any girls among the prepubescent readership who were still in control of themselves after that revelation must have finally snapped their elastic this month, when the pin-up position was taken over by the monumental form of Mark Reason. All it takes is a steady diet of Mars bars and crisps, and you too can have a skin like Mark's. Put some colour in your cheeks. But if the British eat potatoes and look like them, Americans can eat potatoes and look like something that stepped off Mount Olympus. The current issue of Muscle and Fitness, a terrific magazine which I recommend, has an article on what a potato diet can do for your body. Apparently, it's important not to peel the potato because its nutrients are in the skin. So are his, by the look of him. The World Amateur Bodybuilding Championships were in Singapore this year and threw up some amazing developments, including that of America's Bob Paris. Bob is actually giving a Masonic signal here, which means... The Masonic signal means, help, I have mistakenly oiled my body with araldite. And here, Roy Chavez indicates the area of his body he is currently working on. Ulf Larsen straightens a paperclip without looking. And Mohammed Makawe points at a coin he has dropped, and which, for obvious reasons, he can't pick up himself. We started late, and it's getting later, so it's the time of night for uninhibited speech, and the woman to provide that is Germaine Greer. Germaine Greer's career began in the 1950s in Melbourne, an obscure ex-gold mining town in the Australian outback. There, she scratched an existence in a factory testing the quality of imported Frankie Lane 78 RPM records. For a long time, she was married to Australian Prime Minister Sir Robert Gordon Menzies and did a lot of entertaining. The ingredients of her lemon meringue pie were so powerful they had to be mixed in a centrifuge. Divorced from Menzies, she married Harold Holt, John Gorton, Guff Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser in quick succession, but already she felt rebellious against Australian macho male dominance. Rather than marry Bob Hawke, she invented the Greer Mark I walking frame for tall female botanists. Still dissatisfied, she left for Europe by the most direct means of transport. Speaking personally, I'd known Germaine half my life before she wrote a book which made me realise that I hadn't really known her at all. She gave a lot of men their first notion of the justifiable resentment that had built up in the souls of their sisters. She gave a lot of women their first heady taste of self-expression, although I still think it's questionable whether most women or most men have, can have, or should have as much self to express as she thinks. But she thinks, more originally than any other Australian of my generation. She's seen a lot of Australian men growing up absurd, including me. In fact, she's got enough on me to hang me, so I'm going to look at least as pleased as I really am in welcoming Germaine Greer. Germaine, the last time we met was on Parkinson's show in Sydney.
That's right. I had to give you 2 kisses then, by the way, because 1 kiss is significant. 2 kisses mean nothing at all.
And also, we deserved it for the long trip across Parkinson's set, because the set was enormous in Australia, wasn't it?
Well, you're not doing too badly here with all this crumpled suedette.
We call it the Kohinoor restaurant. You've just arrived from Italy, where you have a house. What do you like?
A garden. Note.
That's from your Italian garden?
Hard-working girl, yes. Aren't they disgusting?
They
Talk
look
about
wonderful.
Princess Diana.
Oh,
I have to put them under my shoulders.
Artisans' hands. What do you like about Italy?
Well, everybody talks as loudly as I do and makes as much noise. I mean, in England, I always felt I was about to knock the bric-a-brac off the occasional table, but in Italy, I just carry on.
But there must be more to it than that, just the noise level.
That's a good deal, but also people sing at their work. It's an acid test I have for any place on earth. I sort of patter out and have a look and see if the man sweeping the street stops and goes, "Sole mio." If he does, I think, oh, that can't be bad.
And then what do you do?
I say, buongiorno. What else would I do? I don't pinch his bottom or throw my drink over him.
What about all the cultural stuff and the paintings and the sculpture and all that? Do you go for that?
Yeah. No, well... I do go for that, but the trouble about all of that is you have to go in the winter, because in the summer you can't see it for Americans flexing their muscles and looking like unpeeled potatoes.
Too many touristi.
Too many touristi.
Have you got some sort of affinity with Italy because you were raised as a Catholic? Has that got anything to do with it?
I honestly don't know. My grandfather's Italian, but I never met him.
So you don't think it's sort of in the blood?
Listen, Clive, you understand it perfectly well. Do you realise that my family name is Lanfranchi? And there's a Lanfranchi in the Divine Comedy. In the Ugolino episode, there's a member of my family.
You're telling me you read the Divine Comedy and then it occurred to you have to go to Italy and set up a house.
I knew I had to go away from Australia when I was 12. I used to ride my bike down to Port Melbourne and watch the boats moving out and the stream is breaking and cry my eyes out.
Let's get to leaving Australia.
You know how far Port Melbourne was from where I live, by the way. It was 16 miles.
And you rode your bike?
Yep.
Well, let's get to leaving Australia in a minute. Let's get a bit of Australia in first. Tell us what you were like when you were a tot. Were you a religious child?
I was religious when I was 14. I was in love with Christ when I was 14. And I used to practice passing out in church. I used to kneel with my arms raised until I got pins and needles, and then I'd go... But actually, I never did faint, as a matter of fact. I was too jolly strong. I was there for hours and hours and hours, and all those Australian calories kept me propped up in front of the high altar for hours.
What was the effect on the rest of the congregation when you toppled like that?
You don't do that sort of thing in public now. You do that after school. That's when the sneaky holy people go to church, you see.
Well, then you went to a religious school, though?
There was another girl who used to do this, by the way, and she married a Queensland pig farmer and had 13 children.
It was a religious school you went to. They told you to have a lot of children, didn't they?
No, they didn't tell me to have any children at all.
What did they tell you?
Chastity was the highest calling.
Like forever?
Forever. Oh, yes, indeed. And I could see from the nuns it didn't do you any harm, particularly.
You like the nuns?
I suppose I loved them, really. They were pretty dotty. But the thing about the nuns is that they broke all the stereotypes about women. They were completely original people and quite eccentric. And I didn't realise until a long time afterwards just how eccentric they were.
But I got the impression when I met you much later at Sydney University that you were sort of fighting off the influence of a very repressive religious education. You're telling me it wasn't repressive at all?
I don't know, you see. What was there to repress? I was 13 and I was 14. I was spotty and ugly and flat-footed and all the things that Linda Lee Potter says I am.
Did she say that?
She said something unkind about my feet.
Linda Lee Potter said that?
Yes, do you know who she is? Have you ever met this person?
I try to keep tabs, as a matter of principle, I try to keep tabs on everybody in England with 3 names, because eventually... because they're almost always important, but I never quite figured out which one Linda Lee Potter was.
She says that she's met me, but I can't remember it. But somebody told me she's so insignificant, I wouldn't have remembered if we were locked in a lavatory together, so... As far as I know, I've never met her, but she does say I've got knobby feet, and sooth to say, it's... Oh! It's true.
Germaine, you can come here and kick my set to pieces anytime you like.
That's interesting. You just can tip that right over.
Yeah, you can, because nothing's nailed down around here, you see.
You trust everybody.
Well,
You've got combination locks on the makeup rooms in this place.
Parkinson's set was all welded together like a North Sea oil rig. It cost so much
Including
money.
Parkinson. We shouldn't say such horrid
You shouldn't say. I never said it. Linda Lee Potter and Parkinson, you've nailed 2 of them already. Tell me more about these nuns.
No, Parky's sweet.
Yeah.
No, but his wife is sweeter.
She's not a nun. Tell me more about these nuns.
Well, doesn't everybody know about nuns?
No.
I mean, my nuns were all dressed in black. There was sort of a series of black drapes, like the Footlight stage, actually. And they had these starched horns that stuck out here, and they had starched bands under their chins, which they used to go like this. In hot weather, and they had hat pins in it. I used to wonder when a hat pin was going to pierce the jugular. I knew they were miraculous people because it never happened.
Why didn't you become a nun?
Well, it looked like a cert in about 1954. But then in 1955, a terrible thing happened, which was that a very, very clever nun began to teach me the philosophical proofs of the existence of God, which wasn't very smart because they're all invalid. And I thought, uh-oh, if that's the only reason for thinking there's a God, I'm afraid. So the disastrous thing happened that I began to doubt the existence of God.
Lost your faith. So what do you owe the nuns, in retrospect?
I think I probably owe them everything. I wouldn't have known anything about music or painting. I wouldn't have known anything about writing either. I wouldn't have thought that I could do the impossible. The nuns were all visibly doing the impossible. And so just sort of doing my own thing seemed relatively easy.
So really they gave you nonconformity and...
Yeah, I think they were really pretty crazy.
Why did you leave Australia?
Oh, gosh. Because I couldn't stay there. I mean, it was a one-way ticket from the time I was 12, but I didn't know how I was going to get away. And it took me 13 years to get a scholarship to Cambridge, and that's when I finally got away. And I knew I wasn't going back. And don't ask me how these decisions are made. I don't know. It's a bit like growing up. I didn't actually decide to be 6 feet tall. It just happened.
But they're not exactly the same thing. I mean, you're 6 feet tall because you're 6 feet tall. But...
Actually, I'm getting smaller now. Dowager's hump is looming.
There's a lot we could say about humps, but what I want to know is...
There isn't a lot we could say about humps. Let me take the opportunity to deny that. There is nothing whatever you and I can say.
Leaving aside the hump momentarily, steering around the hump. Leaving Australia, that's a decision.
Do you remember swinging through those trees to impress me? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
You've no idea. You cannot imagine how fit this man was. You were the only fit man at Sydney University, and boy, did you make a display of that. He had the biggest shoulders and the flattest stomach, and you were the only person who'd done Nasho. No one
National Service. They don't know what National Service means. I'm perfectly ready to listen to the rest of it. I love all this stuff about my shoulders and flat stomach.
He was so muscly. You were brilliant, of course. Then as now, my dear.
It's very, very flattering of you.
But not sexy, alas.
No. That's my tragedy. See, I spent a lot of time swinging through the trees, but I wasn't sexy.
You were very good at swinging through the trees, and the trees didn't suffer any damage at all.
I remember I tried to impress you once by grabbing a parking meter and standing out sideways. I could do that quite recently. The day I found out I couldn't do it was a disaster for me and the parking meter. Are you glad you left Australia? Let's leave aside the question of swinging through the trees, which is, very touchy ground. Are you glad you left Australia?
Yes, I suppose I am, really. I'm sad that I can't go back. I mean, I thought I could go back.
Wait, why can't you go back?
Because when I was little, there was this great grey beast that dominated my life, which was called boredom. I didn't know it was called any such thing, but I spent a lot of time being really dreadfully bored. And the last time I went back, I stayed 4 days. But it seemed to me every time I went round a corner, I saw this great grey thing just vanishing around the corner ahead of me. Boredom is very close to the surface, I think. It's too safe there.
Don't you think it's sort of, if you stay there for a while, you might get... I'm just asking you. I feel the same, but I never managed to convince myself that this was a justifiable reaction to Australia. The fact is, we left. We spent more than 20 years away, and when you're that way along from a country, it's very hard to go back.
It's true. You can't go home. You cannot go home, and you learn that eventually. Although the curious thing is that I'm now closer to my brother and sister than I've ever been, and I really feel terrific when I'm with them. And it's great being with people that you don't have to explain anything to. They know it all. I mean, one look from my sister, and she's told me a chapter, and no need for any explanations. I love all that.
Let's go to England in the 60s, where you got very, very well known. Did you aim to become well known? Was that...
You thought I did. You told some silly television thing called Face Your Image
Let's
that
not
I
get
was
into...
thirsty for fame.
Let's not get into what we
now
told...
Now that you're famous, could anybody who wasn't an imbecile be thirsty for fame, Clive? What is good about fame?
I'll let that one go by into the net, because you've been so kind about my flat stomach. But let's not get into what...
about being famous. The only thing one wants is recognition from one's peers.
Yes.
And I think I had that, don't you?
Linda Lee Potter. She's a peer, you can tell by the name. Let's not get into what we told the media about each other, because you told some dreadful things. That guy out in Australia, and the really awful thing about it was true, everything you told him.
Well, I got it all wrong about somebody else.
No.
I said it was Bob Ellis who broke his finger on the table, and it turned out to be
let's leave that aside. Let's leave that aside anyway. So you didn't aim to become well known in the 60s, you just became well known. Actually, I think that's probably so. Your personality was too big for ever to languish in obscurity. You can't answer that, can you?
No. What can I say? I've always been conspicuous, but it's never been really much fun. You can't shoplift when you're as conspicuous as I am.
When did the female eunuch dawn on you? When did you know you were going to write that book?
I think it was when I got married and realised I was in the worst trouble I'd ever been in my life.
When did you realise that? Like straight away?
Well, when I realised that my husband was in love with me and therefore he hated me. Does that make sense to you? Because I wasn't in love with him. I just thought it was a good idea. I thought we might get on well together. Ho, ho, ho. He got killed.
So you wrote this book. Did you guess that it would become what it did become? A sort of...
No. I was only hoping it wouldn't be remaindered. I didn't want to go to the British Museum past that shop. Do you remember that shop that used to sell remaindered titles and see there's stacks and stacks of this book? I just hoped no one would lose money.
In your latest book, Sex and Destiny, you seem to be saying that the West is finished. I just wanted to ask you, don't you think that's rather a Western view?
Spengler and all that. It's not only a Western view, it's terribly old-fashioned. I don't know whether... I think our culture's finished. I think it's a sort of dead-end culture. The comfort deadens the brain, and we're all soaked in it.
Does that mean that you spent a lot of time praising other cultures, which it occurs to me that 20 years ago you would have been slower to admire some of these sort of African or Indian families that were really practicing some fairly hideous rites. Now you seem to say that sort of thing is better than what we've got.
We've got some pretty hideous rites as well. I think glue sniffing's fairly stupid and fairly... death.
But it's a matter of choice, isn't it?
Well, is it a matter of choice? I'm not sure. I think our kids are very sad. I think a lot of our young people are really broken-hearted. I think a lot of their culture is post-nuclear. They're behaving as if the disaster's already happened. They dress as if they've just been dug up out of their graves. I mean, it's I don't know. I really don't know. The thing is, I was always attracted to traditional cultures. People have all forgotten that they sneered themselves into strictures when I wrote The Female Eunuch because of the passage in it about Calabria, where I'd lived for a few months when I was finishing my PhD. And I loved the people there. And they were ignorant, they were poor, there was a column of flies dancing above the dinner table, and the children could never be put on the ground because the ground was dirt. But I loved it. I thought they were great people.
Germaine, I take your point about the imminent collapse of the West, but I can't help feeling you'd be less pessimistic if you'd met Mr. Right. Have you ever met Mr. Right?
I've never been remotely interested in him. I've spent my whole life looking for Mr. Wrong. It's much more exciting.
What about Bob Hawke? What do you think of him?
Well, he's different now, you know, since he's off the booze. I hope.
How, granted that he ever was on this substance that you mentioned, how was he then? Did you
Look,
meet him?
I met him once. We had to do a television debate. And I got to this place where we were doing this debate, and I was sitting in my dressing room looking at the wall, when a minion ran along and said that Mr. Hawke would like to meet me. So I said, oh, well, all right, and padded down after this guy and went into Hawke's dressing room to hear the shower running, speaking of the showers. And I thought, this is a funny thing. And a voice said, oh, Germaine, could you hand me that can of Foster's over there on the table? So I, being an obedient Australian girl, I snapped to attention, grasped the can of Foster's and turned towards the shower to see the manly form of the future Prime Minister half out from behind the dimpled glass. And the dimpled glass giving me a pretty fair idea of what remained beyond. And I thought this was fairly pathetic, actually, in a future head of state. Mr. Brezhnev didn't do things like that, I don't think. And Reagan hasn't done them for ages.
Germaine, I'm sure you could say a lot more in that vein in a few minutes. In a few minutes you'll get the chance. But for now we have to say thank you very much. I think the Australian Embassy's on the phone already. Germaine Greer will be back soon with this man, repressed, chauvinistic, unregenerately macho Alan Coren. With highly educated people in the studio, the opportunity offers itself to discuss education, a matter of crucial importance to the future of this country and indeed the world. In the United States, the attempt goes on to educate the president in the differences between communism and legitimate aspirations towards political freedom in Central and South America. Note the wire leading along the floor and up into the president's speech centers. The wire receives information and instructions from the Reagan Administration Center of Foreign Policy Studies, the Institute for the Containment of the Influence of Marx, situated in Disneyland, California. Meanwhile, the president's wife, Nancy, has been appointed professor of cosmetic surgery at Yale. Education is also important to the Japanese, who expect a high degree of motivation from their students, such as these trainee Japan Airlines pilots, here preparing for their graduation jump without a parachute. But above all, education is a matter of concern for the British, since it divides them into two nations. The ruling classes still send their sons to such public schools as Eton, where they become accustomed to a life of privilege. The lower orders, however, attend comprehensive schools where the masters live in luxury. But for the pupils, the occasional thrashing from a visiting actor is the only relief from grinding banality. What is education for? Is there still such a thing? Should there be? To help answer these questions and think of better ones, Germaine Greer is still here, and joining her is the editor of Punch and a star student before he turned himself into one of the most brilliant writers, humorous or non-humorous, of his time, Alan Coren.
You know, the most unsettling thing in the world for a normal human being is to get to a party late and find the room full of Australians. Yeah.
The point, well, let's start with you, Alan. Just to really put you at ease, let's ask you a difficult question straight up. Did the quality of your education depend on you, the system, or the teachers? Answer on one side of the paper.
I think it depended almost entirely on me because I chose a course of education where teachers couldn't help enormously, in that I chose not to be educated in those things where you had to learn a great deal. I just read books. I started very early reading books. All my life I've spent doing for a living what I would otherwise do for a hobby. As soon as I could, I shot myself all those things you had to do.
How did you get away with that at school, though?
Well, it's very easy. I mean, one of that generation that went to grammar schools, I went to the 11 plus, and at 11 years old, they came and they put a guillotine down the middle of the class, and half of them went off to work in local government, the other half went off to be welders. I always wanted to go with you raised the Divine Comedy. I had that image of watching the other side of the river, and all the kids that I knew and liked were going off to be welders at the local secondary modern. And I was stuck with the clericals. But once you'd established yourself as a clerical, they didn't then, certainly not at my grammar school, which was very enlightened, force you to be a mathematician, a scientist, a geographer, an economist, or anything else. They said, here's a kid who can read books. Let's leave him there to read books. And in 5 years' time, we'll set an exam on those books. And if he's any good, we'll keep him here for another 2 years, and we'll get another exam on fairly similar books. That's all I ever did. I learned a bit of French and German.
Germaine, did they give you a choice at school? Did they let you find your own way?
I did everything, actually. I did everything you could possibly do. I did things you weren't supposed to do together. I did German and Italian, which actually were at the same time every day. But I did them because I wanted to do them. I knew, you see, the thing about me is that I was actually digging my tunnel. That's what I was doing at school. I was going to take anything they could give me because it was going to get me out of there.
I think you two people must have just very, very strong instincts, which isn't necessarily true for everyone.
The thing about English education then was that you were allowed to specialise very, very early. Later on, I went to meet Germans who were doing 15 subjects at their second stage of Abitur when they were 18. I subsequently went on to American universities where people of 21 were still doing 10 subjects. They were doing psychology and ballroom dancing and tuba playing and exegetical marginalia and the Divine Comedy, and they were still doing it. And they didn't specialise till much later. But I dropped everything. I dropped geography at 12. I learned a little bit of geography about countries that no longer exist and the imports and exports of tiny places in Africa that are now called something else. And mainly import and export Czech guns. But those were the days of flax and rattan. It wouldn't have stood me in any stead if I'd done any more. Exactly the same with math. I did levers in physics. I think there are 3 levers. I got to 2, maybe. The third one, you could stand and shift the world, but I never got to that one. And you were allowed to specialise, because we had, I think, a fairly enlightened system that picked out the kids who were never going to be any good at those things and found 1 or 2 things they could be good at. And you did O-levels just in art subjects.
How do you remember your teachers? With affection or loathing? Or?
Well, I remember one with enormous affection because she reclaimed me from my parents' very worthy desire to have me turn into something that would earn a living. The great plan would be that I would be an accountant, which I might have liked. It was somewhere between a welder and a writer. You could be an accountant. And after I did O-levels, this teacher, Miss Brooks, who I remember with great affection, spoke to my parents and said, no, I really don't think this child should be let loose on anybody's ledgers. I think if we keep him here for a bit, he could read a few more books, and then he could go to university, and then, who knows, he could read books for the rest of his life. And that's what I did, and I remember her with great affection. And a man called Mr. Henbest, who was the woodwork teacher. I didn't know then. I know things now. I know that a really great man can stand by and watch other people ruin the thing he loves without comment. Every Tuesday, 40 small boys would go into that room and desecrate a tree. We made cat pegs that fell off and toast racks that went like that, like dominoes. And great man. I quite like doing that. I did woodwork and books. And I remember those 2 people particularly. And 1 or 2 that you hate. You remember those that you hate, but I wouldn't mention them now.
The strange thing is that I think you're a saint like Germaine who remembers the nuns with such affection. I only remember the teachers I hated. Mainly because I had a science teacher who ruined science for me. Not out of malevolence, it's just he was 108 years old and I couldn't understand what he said. And he retired 5 times, and each time they brought him back. And I couldn't follow what he said. He would say, occasionally a word would crop up, I would recognize. Magnesium, oxygen, and I couldn't do it. And that was the end of my career as a scientist. Suppose I'd wanted to be a scientist. Suppose fate wanted me to be a scientist. That's where it went.
I quite like the idea of science, the possibility of it. I mean, I would walk past chemistry labs, and I was never allowed as a kid to look in chemists' windows because they had these strange prosthetic things and bottles. And you won't remember that. In England, everybody was very worried about their bowels between about 1945 and 1950. And the science labs were like that, and I thought if they let me in there with those Limbecs and those test tubes, I could learn things. But the one or two things I tried, like getting a Bunsen burner onto that tap they used to have. So I left science.
Germaine, in Sex and Destiny, you criticise sex education in schools. Now, why is that? What's wrong with sex education in schools?
Well, my idea about that is that they're going to teach a sort of orthodoxy. There's be a right way of doing it, and in my view, there's absolutely no right way of doing it. I mean, they'll teach us to be tolerant about homosexuals and so on, but they're already imparting to people the idea that there's a normal sex life which we should strive to have. And the thing is about school children, I don't know if you've noticed, but if you start teaching normal sex in school, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to do everything else but. I mean, geography is just travel by another name, but they've surely made it boring. I mean, if you ever went to one of those little places in Africa where jute and all that stuff comes from, you'd be amazed how interesting it is, but it wasn't interesting in school.
Well, let's stay on. Let's leave the jute aside, along with the humps, and talk and stay on the sex. What do you think of sex education?
Well, I don't know what sex education there is in schools now.
Well, there's a lot more than there was for us, isn't there?
Yes, I had Reverend Lumley would come in and draw a flaccid penis on the blackboard in green chalk, and then attempt for 40 minutes not to talk about it. Then the result of all this, and faced with a class of very streetwise small boys, would be that he would go out of the classroom at the end. He could never quite bring himself to rub the thing off. Castration problems. And he would leave it on the blackboard. He would go out of a room with a penis on the blackboard and leave 40 boys with chalk in the room. So we learned a lot that way. But I don't know how it's taught to children now. Certainly my own son, I don't think he's actually taught it at school.
How old is he?
He's 14.
Well, he's probably...
He knows an enormous amount of... I think they no longer need to.
I remember it pretty much the way you said, perhaps without the chalk drawing. That's why I was so stunned in Germaine's book to find out that she's recommending coitus interruptus now as a sort of acceptable method of sex. Because that's what...
I'm not doing that, actually.
Well, you're saying that these tribes you're talking about are really terrific at coitus interruptus.
The tribes I'm talking about are mostly Italians. You can hardly call them a tribe. English, you know.
My point is that we didn't need to be taught about coitus interruptus because that was the only kind of coitus we knew anything about. In fact,
it wasn't getting out that was the problem when I was...
It was exactly. In fact, it was coitus... It was coitus non-status, wasn't it?
But what I want to know is, I mean, it's true the 50s were 10 years of foreplay. And at the time, we all thought there was something very much better if only we'd been allowed to do it. There was stuff that, you know, if you read Hemingway, it said the earth moved. So when we finally did do it, we finally wheedled all sorts of strange appliances to allow us to practice some sort of contraception. And we finally did it the right way, the way it's described in the rainbow and all that stuff. And the earth didn't move, so we did it again. And we've been doing it again and again and again and again, and the earth still hasn't moved. Did you read those kids in the News of the World saying, oh, well, it's a bit of a bore, really, but I don't say no to anybody. I mean, I'm on a pill, and I mean, why be difficult, you know? They're all nice. I dare to suspect that the 50s, although they were full of anguish and aches and pains and whatnot, I think we probably had a lot of fun, really.
Right, back to the 50s and onward to university, Alan. What happened at
Oxford? Left my sex education.
No, your sex education, we're leaving
What about these lucky people who had 10 years of foreplay?
What were you doing in the back of the Ford Prefect?
Well, he was a comprehensive...
No, I had a two-seater. That's why I'm so adept.
Well, you were at a co-educational school, though, right?
Yes, I was.
Well,
yeah. That was wonderful. I mean, becoming pubescent in company.
Is that where sex began?
Good. I will not immediately say that's where it ended, but certainly that's... It was strange. It was very odd being in a co-educational school because I sort of perceived women early on as things with... persons with whom I would compete. I mean, it was an achievement-oriented school. Everybody was hungry to learn and get the gongs and go on and get more gongs. And the girls tended to be brighter than the boys. So my first experience of girls, first 2 years when I was 11 and 12, well, these were objects that I really disliked because they were unfamiliar and they were cleverer than I was. So we had to beat them at that. After the age of 14, I wanted to impress them. And they were bright. So you had to be cleverer than they were as well. So my entire life has been involved with competing with women to impress them with how bright I am.
You're doing that
and you
now.
bring me on next to her, which is difficult. Like a whetstone. But quite seriously, the pattern of co-education for me was competing with people that I would subsequently have to get into bed with.
All of them. Onward to Oxford. What happened at Oxford after this?
Well, there was this big mulatto stripper. What do you mean? What happened at Oxford?
What was Oxford? Were you ready for Oxford? What was it like as a cultural experience?
It was like a chat show with more people, and we sat around. Not as bright, but we sat around in larger or smaller groups. I read English, which I literally read it. It's the only subject where the reading works. I sat under trees and read these books and began to understand them for the first time. I mean, I had read The Rainbow when I was 13 at school. The thing that's really wrong with literary education, if we're going to talk seriously about education in this country, is we give... In my special corner, or indeed in all our special corners, we are trying to develop critical faculties in kids, and we're doing that by giving them books they don't want to read. I mean, if you're going to teach kids to develop critical faculties, get them to watch Dallas or Tucker's Luck or Grange Hill and then write essays on that. You don't give them the Prelude. You don't give them King Lear, and they say it's a play about old men, it's a miserable... You don't know about King Lear till you're nearly my age, and you know about old men, the difficulties of hanging on to what they created.
Do you agree with that, Germaine?
Yes, except I don't think there's any point in exposing kids to bad art. When I was teaching literature, we had a book of absolutely disgusting poetry, which I was supposed to teach to these kids who were on something called the alternative curriculum, because they thought I was very stupid. Actually, they had very few verbal skills, but in many ways they were very bright, and I loved my little girls very much. In fact, I actually broke into the principal's office, I shouldn't be saying this on television, and tore up their records which said they had IQs of this, that and the other, because it was unfair. They were going to be marked forever as imbeciles, and they weren't. And because they said I couldn't teach them literature, but I put literature into them. They belonged to me. I was the only person who could control them. And we used to, because we had so little time, I taught them sonnets. And I chose the best sonnets I could find. Every single sonnet was perfect. And I taught the sonnets to them as charms and incantations. They were going to spend the rest of their lives in the pickle factory, but at least when their minds were empty, these wonderful threads would come into them. And they loved it. And when I left, I went to teach at the University of Sydney, and I remember this strange little delegation arrived one day, 5 schoolgirls with a bunch of flowers that they'd nicked on the way to the school, on the way to the university, and they said, "Oh, miss, could you come back sometimes, just, like once a month or something? Because we don't like poetry anymore." And the reason was not just that I wasn't there, but it was that they were no longer being taught good poetry. I don't think there's any future in teaching bad art, but there's some skill in choosing the right good art to teach.
I think ideally you're presenting them with a certain artifact and trying to persuade them what is wrong with it by self-discovery. And then you can get them onto Petrarch.
But you see, I think kids can understand Romeo and Juliet. They can understand it better than I can. Juliet is 14. They can tell me how she feels and why she talks that way.
Don't speak 14.
Ah, but you grow up fast when you're in that kind of trouble.
This is an extremely informative discussion on Romeo and Juliet, and I'm all for it, but I want to move you on. I want to move you on to Cambridge, because I got him to Oxford, but I want to know what I think Oxford must have been familiar to him, because it's in the same country, at least. What was Cambridge like to you? Was it a culture shock to go from Australia to Cambridge?
It was strange, because I knew England from literature, not from paintings or from visual impact, and I knew Italy from paintings. So, in fact, when I went to Italy, it was very familiar. When I came to England, it was all a bit wrong. Nothing was quite what I expected it to be. And Cambridge was frankly dull, and the teaching wasn't very good. And I shopped about for... I thought that my provincial teaching in Australia was probably not much good. In fact, I was taught by a very brilliant man called Sam Goldberg, and I now realise I had the best undergraduate teaching I would probably have got anywhere in the world. And for that, I'm immensely grateful. But I didn't know that when I came to Cambridge. I came as an undergraduate. I shopped around and insisted on 2 particular teachers who didn't want to be bothered with me, who actually didn't teach my sort of student at all, and in the end I had to jettison doing an undergraduate course which I wanted to redo and do it better, and I went on to do a PhD, which was in a way a great defeat for me, because you can do a PhD anywhere. You can do a PhD at the bottom of a well as long as you've got a few books.
I'd say my culture shock in arriving at Cambridge in '65 was finding the first thing I met was you.
I wasn't at all surprised to find you there, talking about Shelley and Plato. Do you remember talking about Shelley and Plato?
Endlessly. Talking, I suppose what Oxford and Cambridge are like, and I imagine all the other universities too, but Oxford and Cambridge have been at it longer, is talking. Isn't that the main thing you got out of it? It was
Yes, I
something.
suppose so. But I was thinking about Germaine's culture shock translating from Australia to Cambridge. I had the same thing when I left Oxford and went to American universities, and it is very curious how you develop a set of terms for dealing with teachers or dealing with learning for 15 years, and suddenly you're dumped down into a different system.
Where did you go to Yale?
I went to Yale, I went to Berkeley, and I think the most instructive one I spent was the first semester at the University of Minnesota. I went there to do a course, couldn't do the course now, it's called the American Negro, but I went there to do a course with a bloke who knew. And I was staggered then at the relationship between American teachers and American students and the quality in American graduate schools. I'd been led to believe that they were jocks and oiks, and they weren't. It was quite extraordinary standard of American graduate school teaching. You're looking quite sceptical about that.
Don't go to Tulsa.
I thought it was very Tulsa.
Just don't go to Tulsa.
You went, Alan, but to take it personally, what would you say you'd learned from your education when you think back on it? Is there anything you got from your education that you couldn't have got just by reading at home?
That's enormously hard. I mean, the activity I currently pursue is fairly frivolous. I am able to dignify it by slotting in stuff that I've learned along the way. You can always aggrandize a joke by banging in a reference to Lermontov or whatever else. It has enriched some of the way in which I approach the writing of comedy. It was great fun during the period I did it. The best thing about any education is having somebody support you while you actually learn. If you're going to ask me to measure what my life would have been if I hadn't had it, or how far I can measure the effect of it on what I am now, I couldn't begin to do that. I know it was enormously enjoyable then, and when I look at anything now, or when I go somewhere unfamiliar, or I take down an odd book, or I meet a strange man, there are areas of confidence that were bred by that education to know that he's not going to throw me a short left that I will not be able intellectually to handle. And that sort of confidence is quite important. But that's a very sort of practical way of looking at it.
They taught me how to find out what I want to know.
You mean if you hadn't...
My universities taught me that. I now know if I want to know something, I know how to go about finding it out.
Germaine and Alan, there's a lot more we could say on this. We can go on discussing it afterwards, but for now we have to say thank you very much.
I forgot we were here.
The subject is inexhaustible, but unfortunately airtime isn't, so we must close. Next Friday we'll be on early, for 1 week only, at 9 o'clock. So if you want to go on missing us, tune in late. For now, once again, one of our telephone persons will be at the switchboard all night to discuss the programme with you, should you so desire. But only a few lines are open at this hour, so don't ring her. She'll ring you.
Despite what Clive just said, he will be back next Monday at the same time.
The silent film, pictures and music soon became a universal language, a language understood all over the world.
Hollywood, City of Dreams. The fascinating true story told by James Mason premieres Friday night.
The public knew nothing of the making of a film. What they cared about were the glittering stars, the glamour, the escape to another world.
The premiere of Hollywood. Don't miss it. 8:25 Friday on ABC. 9:30 Tuesday on ABC. Richard Carlton and Max Walsh, two of Australia's most respected journalists, present the premiere of the Carlton-Walsh Report. Comprehensive, mid-evening news and current affairs. A unique combination of experience, informed opinion and analysis of current events. News and current affairs on ABC. The National 7 days a week. And now the Carlton-Walsh Report. Premieres 9:30 Tuesday on ABC.
Hello again, John Amies with our final news break from the National for tonight. There'll be no domestic flights operating in and out of Sydney Airport from 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The cancellations are due to a stoppage by airport firefighting personnel. The strike is part of the Federal Firefighter Union's campaign for a 38-hour week. They also claimed there are inadequate staffing levels at 14 of Australia's major airports. The dispute will go before the Arbitration Commission in Melbourne tomorrow morning. And overseas, the Middle East hijack crisis is finally over, with the release of the 39 Americans who've been held hostage for 17 days. The hostages were driven from Beirut to the Syrian capital of Damascus before flying on to Frankfurt. Closer to home, a South Australian study has found that the abolition of tertiary education fees has done little or nothing to give low-income children greater access to higher education. The study by the Tertiary Education Authority of South Australia has been underway since 1975, when tertiary fees were abolished. Police in South Australia say the state government will have to decide whether additional resources will be made available to try and curb the level of drink driving. From today, police will be given wider powers under the random breath testing law. Finally, let's have a look at the weather information, and firstly the forecast for the state. We can expect a fine and mild to warm day at first, with strengthening north to northwesterly winds. A cooler southwesterly change developing in the far west should gradually extend eastwards, with a few scattered showers in the south, and there's also a strong wind warning for all coastal waters. For the city of Adelaide, we can expect a fine day at first, but a shower or two developing later ahead of the change. The temperatures will range from an overnight low of 9 to a pleasant maximum tomorrow of 20 degrees. Well, that's all from the national team for tonight, but we do hope you'll join us again tomorrow night at 6:30. Until then, from all of us here, a very good night.
There's a new Wonder petrol additive, and it comes from gum trees. Little engines, big engines, work well on a fuel mix of petrol and alcohol. But there are problems, like corrosion. In Perth, they believe they've found the solution. Just add the oil of gum trees, and a successful fuel results. The Gum Tree Factor is next and countrywide, 9 o'clock Wednesday on ABC.
Returning soon to ABC, A Big Country with a brand new series. The imaginative architecture and garden landscaping of Edna Margaret Walling. The Henderson Girls, a story of 3 sisters raised from childhood on a remote cattle station. And from Queensland, the resurrection of 6 American fighter planes. To begin this exciting series, a 50-minute special, The Big Bandicoot, a dream to build the fastest sailing boat in the world. Big Country, coming soon to ABC.
And I've gone to a lot of love-ins and music festivals. Many times I've put on a beard and a mustache and wandered around, and I've had an education. And I've learned one thing, that you are one of the most wonderful, challenging generations. You say, well, Billy, what in the world do I have to do? Just 3 things. Here's what you have to do. Listen, you have to tune in, you have to turn on, and you have to drop out.